Hey everyone. Welcome back to Hoa Karen Stories. How's everyone doing today? I hope you're all having a great day. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any of our crazy Hoa drama. It was late afternoon when Sarah returned home. The sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across her front yard. The quiet of the neighborhood was almost peaceful. But as she pulled into her driveway, her heart sank. What lay before her was nothing short of devastation. Her $30,000 solar panel system, carefully installed to make her home more sustainable and energy efficient, was torn from the ground and left in a twisted pile of metal and shattered glass. The wind picked up, scattering debris around the yard. But Sarah barely noticed it. Her eyes were fixed on the wreckage. Anger surged through her, drowning out the sound of the rustling leaves. She stormed out of her car, barely registering Karen, the Hoa president, standing at the edge of her yard with her arms crossed, a smug smile plastered on her face. Well, Sarah," Karen called out, her tone dripping with mockery. "Looks like someone's a little upset." She looked down at the mess like it was a minor inconvenience. The Hoa doesn't allow unsightly additions like these. It's against the rules. Sarah's blood boiled. Unsightly? These panels are state-of-the-art. They're barely visible from the road. And they're legal. You can't just... Karen cut her off with a dismissive wave. It doesn't matter. The Hoa is in charge of what's allowed. And this doesn't fit the neighborhood's aesthetic. You've been warned. Warned? You've destroyed my property. Karen. This is theft, illegal. You can't just rip it out because you don't like it. Sarah's fists clenched at her sides, her voice rising in fury. Karen's smile didn't fade. It's not illegal when the Hoa enforces its rules. And I'm the one who has the final say. She leaned back, clearly pleased with herself. Maybe next time you'll think twice before going against us. Sarah stood there, stunned, the words sinking in slowly. You're saying I have no rights to my own property? That you can just destroy it on a whim? That's exactly what I'm saying, Karen replied, her smug expression never faltering. Sarah's mind raced, and she took a deep breath to steady herself. I won't let you get away with this, she muttered under her breath as Karen turned her back and walked away, leaving Sarah standing amidst the wreckage of her once prized solar panel system. She had no idea that this would be the beginning of a fight she would never forget. 2 days passed since Sarah had found her solar panels destroyed. And with each passing hour, her anger simmered. But she didn't act recklessly. Instead, she sat in her home office, surrounded by piles of legal documents and research, trying to figure out how to fight back. She sipped her coffee, scanning through utility records, zoning laws, and property deeds. The sound of her mouse clicking and her eyes scanning the screen was the only noise in the room. Then, it happened. Her fingers froze over the keyboard as she stumbled upon something that made her heart race. She leaned closer to the screen, her mind struggling to process the information in front of her. The documents clearly stated that the entire power grid for the neighborhood, including the transformers and power lines, was privately owned, not by the city, not by the Hoa, but by Sarah herself. When she had purchased her house years ago, she'd unknowingly bought up part of a larger land development. The previous owner had sold off the rights to the power grid as part of the land package before the original developer dissolved the operation. And in those fine print details, Sarah now realized, she owned the power. A grin slowly spread across her face as the pieces fell into place. She thinks she has control over me. She has no idea, Sarah whispered, her pulse quickening. With a few simple adjustments, she could cut the power to every house in the neighborhood, including Karen's. The thought of Karen walking around clueless while the lights flickered out made Sarah feel a rush of satisfaction. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers on the desk, considering her next move. The Hoa had never known about this detail, no one had. Sarah knew Karen wouldn't just back off. But now, she had the ultimate power to level the playing field. Her mind started turning, formulating a plan. This wouldn't be about simply getting revenge. No. This was about teaching Karen and the entire Hoa board a lesson they'd never forget. "I'm going to make them pay," she muttered to herself. Sarah sat up straighter, feeling the weight of her newfound advantage. Karen had no idea what was coming. The best part? Sarah wasn't going to act immediately. She'd wait for the perfect moment, when Karen felt most in control. So Sarah could strip her of that illusion with a single press of a button. And when it happened, Karen would understand exactly what it felt like to be powerless. The evening of the Hoa meeting arrived. Sarah could hear the sounds of cars pulling into driveways as the residents of the neighborhood made their way to Karen's house. Sarah stood on her porch, watching them gather. The moonlight bathed the cul-de-sac in a cold glow. And Sarah took a deep breath, mentally preparing herself. Tonight was the night. Inside Karen's house, the usual crowd had gathered. But the mood felt different. The usual chatter was replaced by murmurs of discontent. Homeowners shuffled uncomfortably in their seats, many of them still resentful of the fines Karen had slapped them with over the last few weeks. Karen stood at the front of the room, her usual smug smile in place as she addressed the crowd. "All right, everyone," she began, raising her hands for silence. "It's time to talk about the upcoming neighborhood projects. We need to get everyone on board with the new regulations. We can't have things falling apart like they did last month. Now, I've made a few changes." Sarah didn't listen to Karen's self-important speech. She was on her phone, silently pressing a button hidden in the palm of her hand. At exactly 8 p.m., as Karen began discussing the repainting of mailboxes, Sarah struck. The neighborhood plunged into darkness. For a split second, there was only stunned silence. Then, chaos erupted. Porch lights flickered, street lamps buzzed and died. And even Karen's obnoxiously bright chandelier, the one that she insisted made her house look like a palace, flickered once before going dark. The entire cul-de-sac was swallowed in darkness. "What the hell?" Karen shouted, her voice shrill as she looked up, eyes wide with panic. She stormed toward the window, peering out at the blackened streets. "Someone get the power company on the phone. This is ridiculous." Neighbors were already spilling out of their homes, their faces illuminated only by the glow of their phone screens as they tried to make sense of the situation. Some muttered about how weird it was that no lights could be seen in any house except for Sarah's. Others exchanged confused glances, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Karen, with her usual air of authority, turned to Richard, her assistant. "Call the electric company. This is an emergency," she barked. Richard fumbled with his phone, whispering something under his breath. He held it up to his ear and frowned. "Ah. They're saying there's no outage in the area. No service issues." Karen's head whipped around. Fury and confusion painted across her face. "That's impossible. Look around. Do you see any lights on?" Sarah couldn't help but smirk as she stepped onto her front porch, pretending to be concerned like the rest of the neighbors. "Strange, isn't it? An outage that only affects the Hoa neighborhood. Nowhere else in town," she said casually. Karen's eyes narrowed as she spotted Sarah at the edge of her lawn. "What do you know about this?" she demanded. Sarah raised an eyebrow, her voice calm and controlled. "I know that the power grid here isn't controlled by the city," she said slowly. "It's private." Richard gulped audibly, his eyes darting between Sarah and Karen. "Private?" he whispered. "Then who?" Sarah smiled, the rush of control making her voice a little sharper. "I do," she said, leaning back slightly. "I own the grid. The power lines. The transformers. The whole system. The Hoa doesn't own it. They just use it. Or well, they did." The crowd fell into stunned silence. Some gasped, while others exchanged confused glances, trying to digest what Sarah had just revealed. Karen's face drained of color as she processed the information, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. You? She stammered, looking from Sarah's smug grin to the shocked neighbors. Yep, Sarah replied coolly, not bothering to hide her satisfaction. The Hoa never bothered to check the deed. But I did. Turns out the developer sold the power grid off years ago. And guess who bought it? Richard. Unable to suppress his shock, muttered, That's insane." The crowd started murmuring. Some visibly nervous. Others clearly angry at Karen. One of the neighbors, a man named Jeff who'd been fined for an unauthorized garden gnome just a month earlier, stepped forward. His face filled with a mix of frustration and excitement. "Hold on," Jeff said, raising his hand. "So this means Alex can cut off the power whenever he wants? Just like that?" Sarah nodded. "That's exactly right." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. People began turning their eyes to Karen, who was now visibly trembling. She had spent years controlling this neighborhood with an iron fist. But now, it was all slipping through her fingers. One neighbor, a woman Sarah had spoken to only a few times, spoke up. "Wait. So does that mean we have to pay him for electricity now?" she asked, her voice shaky. Sarah shook her head, raising her hand to calm the crowd. "No. I'm not charging anyone anything extra. But Karen decided she could destroy my property and get away with it." Karen's face twisted in outrage. "You can't do this. This is extortion. You have to turn the power back on," she screamed, her voice rising in desperation. Sarah took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch long enough to let the tension hang thick in the air. Then, she took a long sip of her beer, savoring the moment. "I don't have to do anything," she said, leaning back. "But I'll make you a deal. I'll turn the power back on right now if you agree to two things." Karen's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "What two things?" Sarah's smile grew wider. "First, you will personally replace every single solar panel you destroyed, at your own expense. No Hoa funds. No fines. Your money. Second, you resign as Hoa president. Tonight." Karen's face twisted in horror as the crowd murmured their approval. Sarah crossed her arms, watching the once tough Hoa president falter for the first time. The tension in the air was palpable. And Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The silence that followed Sarah's bold revelation felt deafening. Karen stood frozen, her face a mix of disbelief and fury as the crowd exchanged stunned glances. She couldn't believe it. She had always thought she held all the cards. But now Sarah was the one in control. Sarah took another casual sip from her beer, savoring the tension that crackled in the air. She had taken down the queen of this neighborhood. And now, it was time to see how far Karen would go to save face. "Here's the deal, Karen," Sarah said, her voice calm and steady as she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You've caused enough trouble. And now you're going to pay for it." Karen's hands balled into fists at her sides. "You think you can just—" "I think I can," Sarah interrupted, her gaze unwavering. "You destroyed my $30,000 solar panels. That's not something I can just let slide. You're going to replace them at your own expense. And secondly, you're going to resign as Hoa president tonight." Karen's face flushed, her lips trembling with anger. "You can't do this. I've worked hard for this position. Oh, I know." Sarah cut in, enjoying the sound of Karen stumbling over her words. "You've worked hard to make everyone miserable, haven't you? Well, that's over now. You've lost control, Karen." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and Sarah could feel the weight of the neighbors' growing support. The power was shifting, and Karen could sense it. A man from down the street, Greg, stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Sarah's right," he said, his tone firm. "She's the one who owns the grid. We've all been at the mercy of Karen's rules for far too long." More people started to nod, some crossing their arms in agreement. A woman named Lisa added, "I've had enough of Karen's fines for the tiniest things. We deserve better." Karen's eyes darted around the group. her face turning beet red. "You can't be serious. You can't just take my position away from me like this," she shouted, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. The crowd was now firmly against her. People started to stand, hands slowly rising in support of Sarah's proposal. A few even pointed fingers at Karen, muttering about how they'd had enough of her overbearing leadership. Jeff, the man who had been fined for his garden gnome, stepped forward with a grin. "I second that. Let's vote. It's time." Karen stepped down, without waiting for more prompting. Sarah raised her hand, signaling for a vote. One by one, hands started to go up. Slowly at first, and then more confidently. The final blow came when Richard, Karen's assistant, raised his hand as well. Much to Karen's horror. "Looks like it's unanimous," Sarah said, her voice low with satisfaction. "You're out, Karen." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The humiliation was too much. She had spent so many years controlling this neighborhood with an iron grip, and now, it was slipping away in an instant. As if on cue, Sarah tapped a button on her phone. The streetlights flickered back to life, and the sounds of neighborhood life began to return. Porch lights, street lamps, even the security cameras around the neighborhood hummed back to life. Every house, except for Karen's, was now bathed in light. The crowd erupted into applause. People cheered, some laughing, others clapping Sarah on the back as they returned to their homes. The power was back on, and the neighborhood was alive again. Karen, however, remained in the dark, her house still shrouded in pitch-black silence. She stood frozen on her porch, her face a mixture of rage and disbelief. "I'm not done with you, Sarah," she screamed, her voice cracking as she turned back toward her house. But no one was listening anymore. They had turned their backs on her. Sarah stood tall, a satisfied smile spreading across her face. She watched Karen retreat to her dark house, defeated and alone. The once proud Hoa president had lost everything, her position, her control, and even the light that had once symbolized her power. As Sarah made her way back to her own home, the sound of her neighbors talking and laughing in the streets filled her ears. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt peaceful, free from the oppressive rules that Karen had imposed. "Enjoyed the darkness, Karen," Sarah whispered to herself as she walked up her porch steps. "You've earned it." And just like that, the power had shifted. Karen's reign was over, and the neighborhood was finally free. The days that followed Karen's dramatic fall from power were a whirlwind. The neighborhood was buzzing with excitement. The oppressive atmosphere lifted as the last remnants of Karen's control crumbled away. Sarah had seen the shift in the eyes of her neighbors, the ones who had always quietly accepted Karen's authority, now openly mocking her. No one was willing to back her up anymore. But Karen, ever the fighter, was not ready to admit defeat. She tried, desperately, to regain some shred of control. She called a private meeting with a few remaining Ho allies. But word quickly spread. No one wanted to hear her excuses anymore. Every time she tried to confront Sarah, the conversation ended the same way, with the cold reality that she had lost. On one particularly tense evening, Sarah was sitting on her front porch, enjoying the warmth of the setting sun, when she noticed Karen across the street. The woman was pacing in her yard, phone in hand, muttering angrily to herself. She wasn't giving up easily. Sarah could hear Karen's shrill voice cutting through the air. "You can't just ruin everything I've worked for," Karen yelled into the phone. "I'll sue her. I'll—" The voice on the other end was drowned out by the distant murmur of neighbors chatting in the street. It was clear Karen's words held no weight anymore. No one cared. Later that week, Sarah finalized the paperwork for her new solar panel system. This time, she made sure it was legally protected, with a clause that not even the Hoa could touch. As she stood on her porch, admiring the sleek new panels being installed, she could feel the satisfaction of knowing she had taken back control of her home and her property. The next few days saw more changes. Neighbors started repairing fences that had been previously penalized by Karen. Lawns bloomed with vibrant flowers, and front yards became welcoming instead of rigidly uniform. People stopped looking over their shoulders, wondering if Karen's eyes were watching their every move. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted, freedom had returned. And then, one morning, the final sign of Karen's downfall arrived. A moving truck rolled into her driveway. Sarah watched from her porch as Karen stood outside, surveying the house she once ruled. There was no defiance in her stance, no anger, just an overwhelming sense of resignation. She was leaving. It didn't take long. By noon, the truck was packed, and Karen was behind the wheel of her car, ready to leave the neighborhood for good. Her reign, her tyranny over the Hoa, had ended. As she drove away, she didn't look back. But Sarah wasn't done yet. That night, after the sun had set and the neighborhood had settled into a peaceful silence, Sarah made one last adjustment. She had a solar-powered spotlight installed, directed at Karen's now empty house. The beam of light shone brightly, casting the dark, vacant home in a soft golden glow. It was a symbol, a reminder of what happens when you mess with the wrong person. And as the light flickered on every night at sunset, bathing Karen's former house in its glow, Sarah knew it would always be there, a testament to the fact that no one, not even Karen, could take her property or her freedom without facing the consequences. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt lighter, freer. People gathered for barbecues and block parties without fear of fines or judgment. Kids played in the streets without having to worry about being scolded for something as innocent as playing on the grass. Sarah stood outside one evening, watching her neighbors laugh and chat, a smile crossing her face. She had done more than just take back her property, she had restored the heart of the community. The oppressive rule of Karen was nothing but a memory now, and Sarah was the one who had made sure it stayed that way. And as the solar-powered spotlight on Karen's old house flickered on for another night, Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Some lessons were better learned the hard way.